You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. And I'm joined today by a very special friend of mine. This is a woman who I met a few years back at an event called the Visionaries Summit. And at the time, there were a lot of impressive and interesting people who came together at this summit seeking to contextualize social problems in the context of spiritual but also methodological solutions to the challenges facing humanity. It was just a good time had by all. But Joy Donnell was unique because she brought a deeply informed perspective on an aspect of American and African American history that I knew very little about. Over the course of time, I'd come to realize she has a wide range of gifts and knowledge and expertise, and she's a returning guest of the Braver Angels podcast. So I'm hoping we'll return again. But for today, we want to talk a little bit about the history of the entertainment industry and how it is that the messages that have come through popular culture have intersected with African American histories in ways that might be surprising to some folks who don't understand the nuances of this story. And so, without further ado, Joy Donnell,
Hi.
it's a pleasure to have you on the Braver Angels podcast.
It's always a pleasure to be here with you, John.
Absolutely. Oh, it's so good to see you. As I said before we got going. Now, you are the co-founder of the Center for Intersectional Media and Entertainment. Is that correct?
That is correct. We pronounce it CIME for
There you go.
short, CIME, because it's
Mm,
about representation and what we see,
mm,
who we see, how we see through the media.
there you go. See me. So tell us a little bit, first of all, about the work of See Me, and how you found yourself becoming connected to this as a project.
Well, I had always grown up looking at the media,
Mm,
right? And I noticed when I was being reflected back in
mm,
the media I was watching, and I noticed when I was very much written out of the story or shown in these strange ways. And I kept seeing it over and over again, right?
mm,
Like constant representations, especially me being a dark skinned Black
mm,
woman in America. A lot of times I would see representations of myself in a kind of subservient, servile
mm,
capacity. I did not really have context within the story or value within the story unless I was physically put next to a white person who really had the value centered
mm,
around them. And after you see that for a while, you start wondering, why is that? Why do I keep seeing that way? And as went into my career, doing more producing, really being involved in media and publicity fronts and things of that nature, I eventually found myself in this cohort. I got nominated and inducted into a cohort of 50 women dedicated to media parity, gender parity within media and entertainment by 2025.
okay.
And I met Dr. Nicole Haggart, who is a professor at Mount St. Mary's University.
Mm,
And all of her research was around the intersection of race and gender within Hollywood. And I also met Monica Lay, and we ended up talking and just said, whoa, wow, like we have an opportunity to do something different if we actually take some of the research that Nicole had been doing,
mm,
what we knew, Monica and myself knew from being within the industry and and myself being an entrepreneur within the media industry as well, and kind of combine that perspective along with the all of the insight from artists and activists, academics, allies in the industry, and audiences, which are all of us, and start to really look at what is it that we have inherited from media.
right.
And that's where we dropped in, not from a shame and blame, not from a, oh, look at what you all are doing and what you've been perpetuating, but actually say, what is this? And how did we all step into this, present with this past that
Mm,
came along with us? As we look at the future, why is it shaped through this lens of what we have been knowing and been receiving this entire time? And one of the things that Nicole really stumbled upon because of her own journey was that there's a lot that we inherit in Hollywood, specifically from the production code. It was a code that was in place from 1934 to 1968.
Hmm.
And it was a self censorship set of rules that were in place that the studio said, we're going to abide by this because this is how we present a moral story. And that word morality, that's the real thing because when you start to look at the code, some very interesting things pop up that don't seem to have anything to do with morality or how to best be a human being. And one of the things that especially stuck out was anti miscegenation,
Right.
which specifically meant that Black and white characters could not be shown together in love, romance, having children, or anything like that. That was immoral.
My parents could not have been portrayed in a television
Exactly.
environment within those years, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Right.
And so we ask ourselves, what is actually the societal and the psycho-spiritual implications of that? When you actually look at the highest rate of interracial dating and relationships and offspring, it's usually from a Black man and a white woman,
Hmm.
right? And so all of these children that exist in this world, in this country, in America, not see themselves and their family and their family's love reflected back to them on screen. And one of the things that Nicole found that was particularly like troubling was the fact that if a white woman was shown to be having sex with a Black man, usually she's going to end up being shown as crazy or a woman of ill repute. And then if she went and got psychiatric treatment, once she was well, she ended up with a white man.
Hmm.
There's only been 6 movies.
And that is true specifically from the period of 1934 to 1968, or are you saying that was a
No,
pattern
that's
after?
a pattern after.
Right. Yeah.
So it's remained this huge taboo
Hmm.
within Hollywood. And Hollywood has only done 6 movies where a Black man and a white woman meet, fall in love,
Really?
have sex on camera, and
Hmm.
end up together at the end of the movie.
Well, there's so much sex on screen these days that you might be surprised about, I guess, that low level representation in that kind of a
Right.
cinematic
And I want to be
scene.
clear
Yeah.
that television is
Mhm.
different from film.
Mhm.
TV has always been better in relation to that than film itself has been. But one of the reasons why film was something that we honed in on is because that's what gets the biggest budget.
Mhm.
That's what actually gets these huge budgets and opportunity and gets the kind of award, representation around it. It's a whole other atmosphere around film than it is television.
Right.
And so many people have film aspirations, but there's always these questions about who gets trusted with the money and why. Who gets the budget and who doesn't get the budget? Whose story and whose approach to that story gets a green light and who's gets told that that's not actually the way that we can represent things, or that isn't going to play in China,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
And so there's all of these audience assumptions and lack of comps that are the direct result of what we have inherited from that production code being in place for 30 years
Hmm.
and being such a cornerstone of what could happen and what couldn't happen. And then even the rating system evolved out of what was that production code.
How is that the case?
Well, basically, with the rating system, it went from what was immoral to what could not be abided by, like what was absolutely forbidden on those grounds. And the industry itself never really cleaned up its mess around what it had done in those 30 years that the production code was in place.
Hmm.
So, things that were seen as immoral or weird, salacious, and entirely too controversial within the production code were kind of still seen that way in the rating system.
Hmm.
And again, a lot of what was considered immoral, things like homosexuality,
Hmm.
things like transgender, all of these things were immoral in the production code. And so we have inherited that. And because of the way that we look to media, and especially our narrative arts, to help us understand one another, right?
Hmm.
It's one of the things Norman Lear Center even has research on how it expands our empathy and our compassion. And I know you and I have talked about this. in my opinion, that's also how your wisdom expands through
Right.
your empathy and compassion.
Mm,
We look to each other's stories and we get deeper insight into what it has been like for you to be human.
mm.
You understand more of what it's been like for me to be human, and we understand more about the human condition together that way. So, to have that kind of censored lens around what can be human and what cannot be is going to shape our societal norms and beliefs, but it's also going to shape and limit what we believe about ourselves to be true and what we believe about ourselves collectively to be true.
Right. Now, it seems clear, to me in the context of the work that I do and the work that we do in Braver Angels and other and the work done by other similar groups that there's no more powerful vehicle for establishing an empathetic understanding of other human beings than storytelling. And certainly, American society and so much of America's reputation around the world in recent generations stems from our artistic output, our storytelling output, right? I mean, Hollywood has revolutionized global culture and is a tremendous part of what reflects back to us as sort of the identity of ourselves and the country. And so, Hollywood as a psychologically influential vehicle really seems to matter. Now, I think
Mhm.
that many of us are under the impression, operate under the impression that Hollywood has been a force for tolerance in American life, and I think that many of us would say that, well, if you look back at the civil rights movement and whatnot, seems that media in general, but perhaps Hollywood in particular, wound up sort of embracing and fueling some of the social changes towards integration that were taking place at the time. You had movies like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Sidney
Mhm.
Poitier. You had, individual actors and celebrities, folks like Marlon Brando and others who took up the cause of civil rights and integration. And obviously, you had your Jane Fondas and anti-war efforts and all sorts of other things. But it seems in listening to the history that you recount that the history there is more complicated for some of the reasons that you've laid out. Is it a mixed bag, or are we looking back on sort of Hollywood at that period of time with rose-colored glasses? And even, perhaps after that, to what degree can we say that Hollywood has been a force for good in this direction? And what how should we balance sort of those realities, those competing impacts that Hollywood may have had on our culture?
I think that it's always been true that there's been individuals within Hollywood
Mhm.
who, through their, heart-centered mindset, really wanted to see things change, and that's why they fought for them, a lot of the people that you mentioned, right?
Mhm.
But we also know that at the same time that there was Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, there was the fact that Hattie McDaniels was not allowed to actually sit in the audience when she won her Oscar.
Mm.
There was the fact that she was told to say that she was a credit to her race,
Mm.
you know, and the fact that she was in a movie called Gone with the Wind that kind of portrayed slavery as not really being that bad.
Mhm.
And it's been one of the highest grossing movies ever in the history of Hollywood. So it, for a long time, was a comp that was in place about how you could go about continuing to tell a story like that. Because the thing is that stories have economies.
Mhm.
And that's really what it's boiling down to, more so than what individuals want to do. There is a system in which individuals exist. We all have it. We have it in society every day with our primary social institutions, right? And media is a primary social institution. And when we look at Hollywood in particular, well, 80% of the media that's consumed around the world comes from the United States.
Mhm.
So, yes, Hollywood and America has particularly been an ambassador of media around the world. And whatever our hangups have been is embedded in the stories that we've imported to other countries.
Mm.
So, the colorism, it's embedded. Sexism, it's embedded. And yes, individuals have wanted to change things, I think always.
Mm.
But then there is the fact that the stories have economies.
Mm.
And from the time of the birth of a nation, which if you're not familiar with that film, you probably are not even really going to watch it because
Mhm.
it portrays the Klan
Mhm.
as the heroes of the South, as the people who are there to restore humanity to
Right.
its former glory.
Mhm.
It
And
was
this is
one,
this is a film that goes back to the early part of the 20th century, but it's something
yeah,
that President Woodrow Wilson actually held a screening of, if I understand
absolutely.
correctly,
Oh,
in
yeah.
the White
Oh,
House,
yeah.
and commented upon it, I think, as being sort of a legitimate representation of American racial history. Yeah.
Yes, it was screened at the White House.
Mhm.
It was funded some sort of way at that time, $100 million movie back
Mhm.
in like, the
Oh wow.
mid 1910s, that's a big deal. And it kind of went ahead and set a rubric. And so then, of course, Gone with the Wind comes along and that same comp lineage and sets the next stage of that rubric. And then you see things like The Help and Driving Miss Daisy, and they are falling along that same rubric, that same trek of money flow. That money has an energy to it. It has a flow to it. It is an economy in of itself, and it means it has stakeholders and it has shareholders,
Mhm.
just like any other economy would. And it becomes a legitimate way to end up having a shot at prosperity in
Mhm.
your career. If you tell a story like this, it will probably be able to get made. If you try to tell the story differently, it might not get made that way. And so people know this
Mhm.
within the system. So yes, absolutely there are people that, have been fighting for change and we are seeing things improving incrementally, but it's not just about it's about more than checking boxes. That's
Mhm.
one of the things I want to be clear about. It's not just about how many, black directors were there,
Right.
how many black screenwriters were there, how many Asian, people are on screen. It's about more than that because also look at the boards,
Mhm.
look at the C-suites, look at who's in the development offices, who greenlights the film. It's a whole trickle down effect of exclusion and lack of access that is bigger than just about what's in front of the camera. It's also about what's behind the camera. And it's
Yeah.
all looped together in the same system.
Yeah, you've preempted the question I was going to ask. What I was going to ask was to say, well, I imagine many folks may think to themselves, but isn't this no longer such a problem? Because I mean, we can look at Denzel Washington to Idris Elba. We could look at Holly Berry. We can name certainly a fair number of A-list recognizable African American and other people of color, celebrities, actors, and so forth. Um, Not to just mention the field of entertainment generally, and say clearly African Americans are front and center in the representation of American popular culture in many
Mm.
respects, right? Will Smith was the most popular, highest paid actor in the world, I think, for some period of time. I'm not
Mm.
sure who it is at this precise moment. Doesn't that therefore mean that this is no longer an issue? But I hear you saying, as you've just said, that representation goes beyond just sort of like in the NFL, how NFL is mostly African Americans, you know players, but you've got all of one black head coach, I think,
Right.
among 30 some odd teams. You're saying something very similar with
And who are
respect to
the owners,
right,
right?
right, yeah.
Like where is really the flow of power and control and access is a bigger thing than just what you see. And no one person can be progress.
Mm,
Just like no one person can be reparations,
mm,
Just because Barack Obama was elected president doesn't mean that all the ills of racism faded away.
mm,
And just because Denzel Washington has been able to have a vibrant career
mm,
and we've got, Viola Davis and we've got Oprah being a billionaire doesn't mean that everything is different for everyone else. These are
mm,
some people who broke through very extreme barriers and were able to figure out how to carve out a space for themselves.
mm,
But it does not negate the fact that there are problems systematically
mm,
all the way down,
right,
all the way up, and all the way down. And the thing about systems like this, culture is set from the top down, not the bottom up,
mm,
right? And we know that within even you look at a company, right? The company culture is not set by the people at the bottom of the company. It's set by the C-suite and the board.
mm,
That's where the company culture comes from.
right,
Well, it's the same way with our social institutions. It's set from the top down and how they go about listening to the cries that are coming from the people that are trying to rise. Well, that's one thing. But where space is created, how space is held, that is so much of the conversation. And when we talk about these ideas of race, we're always talking about bodies.
Mhm.
We're talking about how bodies, certain bodies, can be in certain spaces and places, and other bodies cannot be that
Mm.
way. And even when you look at how long it took to get something like a Black Panther
Mhm.
out, right? But then once Black Panther got out and people saw the reaction to Black Panther, and I
Mhm.
mean the industry,
Right.
well, now everyone that had been trying to get a Black Panther type of script through,
Mhm.
all of a sudden were able to get meetings. They were clamoring for things like
Right.
that because, again, a comp is set, an
Mhm.
economic thing is set that everyone
Mhm.
can aspire to.
Can I inject a little question there? I think that some people would want to offer the argument that, well, perhaps what looks like sort of sort of a racial blockade when it comes to the adoption of certain projects is merely studios having business concerns about the viability of certain productions out in a larger marketplace and in a larger audience that it should be said is, um, disproportionately white just on the basis of larger population sizes in the
Mhm.
country. And so a person could say, well, isn't this just people making safe business bets on what they want to put their money behind as, investors in film projects? But it sounds to me like you wouldn't be satisfied with that as kind of you know, just a catch-all excuse for this sort of disparity.
I love that you brought that up
Mhm.
because, again, I can take that all the way back to the production code.
Okay,
And the
let's do
very
that.
reason why the production code was put into place in the first place
Mhm.
was because Hollywood was essentially bowing down to a very small population of people that they thought were the loudest ones complaining. We know this a lot of times, right? About people who are dissatisfied the loudest
Mhm.
get the most space. But a lot of times it's not the polarized ends that are the truth, it's the middle that is the truth. Well, the middle got taken out of the scenario, and these audience assumptions about what people wanted to see got corralled around these very loud people. So, for
Mhm.
example, there was a society of cinematic owners in the South, and they sent a letter to the production, to the Hayes Code, the production board, and said, "We do not even want to show a film in our theaters that has black and white people on screen together
Mhm.
unless the Negroes are portrayed in a subservient style to the white people on the screen."
Right.
Now, did most white Americans feel that way?
Mhm.
Probably not.
Yeah.
But they didn't get polled, they didn't get asked, and they didn't write a letter.
Hmm.
It was a very small population of people who wrote a letter, and therefore everything within the system changed
Mhm.
to satisfy them. The same way that Germany was one of the biggest overseas viewers of Hollywood films at that time during the production code.
Mhm.
So they would literally, Nazi representatives would literally fly into Hollywood and sit down and watch the film and say, take this Jewish person out of this movie,
Mhm.
change the name of that person, because
Interesting.
they had to satisfy this very small overseas audience.
Mm.
These
Was
audience
Jewish
assumptions.
representation in the film industry on the executive level, and sort of not a factor at that period of time?
It was a factor and not a factor. I mean, basically because of the money that was
Mhm.
behind that German audience,
Right.
overseas
Mhm.
audience. Those emissaries just walked in
Mhm.
with no regard
Mhm.
for who they were talking to.
Right.
It didn't really matter who was in the room.
Mhm.
They were going to go ahead and put down their edict the same way.
Mhm.
And they felt completely within their right to
Mhm.
say who could be on the screen and who couldn't be. And it wasn't just that Jewish representation. They would talk about black bodies,
Right.
brown bodies, whatever kind of body they wanted to have an opinion about, they would have that opinion about.
Mhm.
So to be in 2022 and say, well, are we not just making really smart business decisions, is
Mhm.
going back to 1934 logic
Mhm.
around audience representation and assumptions
Mhm.
that no one actually really got deep data on. And that's why when you see things like the Fast and the Furious franchise,
Mhm.
which continues to break records,
Right.
and they can't, it blows everyone away. And why? It's got all kinds of representation. People go and see the movie 4 times, 5 times in a row with their families, right?
Mhm.
Black Panther broke all of the box office numbers. Why? Because it wasn't going ahead and treating the audiences as if they're intrinsically racist.
Mm. You know, it's interesting, and not to take us too far afield, but it's interesting for me to consider the parallel, the rough parallel in history between what it is you're describing, the sort of small group of agenda-driven stakeholders who are able to sort of prejudice the decisions of the production companies in a way that causes them to sort of convey sort of a racist value system that may not have actually reflected where so many or maybe most of the American people were at, and to compare that to the way the real estate sort of industry and the housing market sort of developed in American society, wherein there was this assumption made and sort of deliberately driven home to realtors, to regulators and governments,
Mhm.
to through public administration, saying that if black people moved into a certain neighborhood, housing prices would fall.
Right.
And so, you had very many white Americans who weren't necessarily personally racist towards African Americans, but who nevertheless would worry that should an African American or should a black family move into their community, that suddenly their investment, their financial
Mhm.
portfolio was going to suffer as a result of it. And that made that a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Right.
Because that assumption that that was the case was suddenly written into the policies that would determine whether or not certain families could get loans to move into certain areas, or whether or not certain white homeowners would even be allowed to sell their properties to people of color, owing to restrictive racial covenants that were justified on the basis of the fact that black people drive down housing values,
Mhm.
home values when they move into a neighborhood. Why? Well, because we say they do, right?
Right.
And so it's this vicious sort of catch 22.
Oh, and there are
Mm,
homes in Brentwood, California right now that still have within the warranty deed of the home
mhm,
that it could never be sold to a person of black descent,
mhm,
Jewish descent, Asian descent,
right,
any kind of, Semitic person.
mm,
It's right there still in the warranty deed,
right,
right? So it also is a thing of I think we need to expand our definition of Jim Crow
mhm,
because it's very nice to think that, oh, well, there were these 23 states in America and they had Jim Crow laws
mhm,
and they were mostly in the South. But Jim Crow practice was rampant and widespread. When you look at the Hollywood production code, the Hays Code, which was something that was in Los Angeles,
mhm,
California, but to say that miscegenation could not be shown on screen, well, that's Jim Crow practice.
mhm,
To look at a place like Minnesota, and see, that did not have Jim Crow laws in place per se, but was very rampantly at the forefront of making sure that Black people and the Asian people and all the people who were the other could not move into certain neighborhoods and areas. Well, that's
mhm,
Jim Crow practice. And for even
right,
the FHA to say that they were only going to green line a neighborhood that had these warranty deeds, these restrictive racial covenants in the warranty deeds,
right,
that's the only way that they would actually get green lined.
mhm,
Well, that's it. That's Jim Crow practice.
mhm,
And that was at the highest level of government. That's actually where you got the money to be able to buy the home,
mhm,
to be able to secure your generational wealth,
mhm,
to be able to provide for your family. And that was in place with the FHA for decades. And
mhm,
it took
right.
going to the Supreme Court 2 times before the third time it was removed.
Yeah, well, what facts like that represent is the fact that segregationist policies in American history existed well outside of the South,
Right.
right? Which is sort of the version of history I think that many of us had inherited, that this was a Southern
Hmm.
problem, sort of solely, really.
Right.
And but history is much more complicated than that. There are two things I want to tie together here. One, I'd like to in, invite you to say a little bit more about the sort of the psychological and cultural consequences for Black Americans in particular historically in seeing either the non-representation of themselves, or a false representation or a demeaning representation. How does that factor into sort of the Black experience as, Black Americans have experienced it sort of over time? And after that, I'd like to sort of pivot to this colorism piece in the present day, because I think for many people, that's that's a very sort of tricky thing to sort of
Mm.
understand, because for many of us, sort of like, well, black is black, right? But take us to that first part. I mean, if you're somebody, you're growing up in, the early part of, the mid part of the 20th century, what are African Americans experiencing as they look at the screen and see people who are supposed to represent them, or are not seeing, not seeing representation at all? What is that experience like?
My goodness, I mean, it's so many things, right?
Mhm.
It's different for each
Of
individual,
course. Right.
but there are some top line things I can take into
Mhm.
context. Like, let me talk about science fiction, for example,
Mhm.
which still is an area within Hollywood that is woefully underrepresented where African Americans are concerned. There
Mhm.
are not a lot of sci-fi films that are being directed by Black directors or screenplays by Black directors. And so one of the pivotal, like cornerstone forefathers of science fiction is H.P. Lovecraft, right?
Mhm.
HBO recently put out Lovecraft Country,
Right.
and it was rather successful. Well, if you know anything about H.P. Lovecraft, he loved Hitler.
Hmm.
He thought Hitler was the guy. And when he was writing all of these fantastical monsters, these threats, he was actually talking about Jewish people, Black people, Muslims,
Interesting.
everyone who is the other. I remember when I was sitting, I was watching, a lot of H.P. Lovecraft as a kid growing up and reading the books, and I started to get this weird feeling. I was just like, wait, who is this? There's something weird about these monsters. There's something weird about the way that the characters are being, besotted with these threats
Mhm.
outside. And then I found out about his personal beliefs.
Mhm.
And while the literary world and Hollywood have like to say, well, this is not part of his oeuvre,
Mhm.
I say, how can it not be? It reminds me of this moment where James Baldwin says, you're sitting there and you're watching Gary Cooper kill the Indians. And
Mhm.
then one day you're realizing that you're the Indians that Gary
Mhm.
Cooper is killing,
Mhm.
that you're the thing that needs to be cured. You're not the thing to be celebrated on screen. And that's one of the things that hits you. There's a term now, microaggression.
Mhm.
We hear it all over the place all the time.
Yeah.
But this was actually coined by a Black psychologist named Dr. Chester Pierce back in the 70s. And he came up with the term microaggression because he was looking at the psychological effects of media on Black children,
Mhm.
is that they were being bombarded every day that they were watching television or going to the movies. They were being overly bombarded by negative images and portrayals of Blackness, of themselves, of their culture, of their people, basically being shown that they were something to be cured,
Mhm.
not to be celebrated. And he coined that term microaggression. These microaggressions are coming through the screen, literally at these children every single day that they sit down in front of the TV. And he went on to be one of the people that helped put together Sesame Street.
Huh.
So when you
Interesting.
look at the
Mhm.
programming of Sesame Street, you see how it was
Mhm.
a counter response to that microaggression that was coming through the screens every
Mhm.
day. Children right there in your living
Right.
room, right?
Those are
Where you
also
were supposed to
happy,
be safe.
friendly, and lovable monsters
Yes.
on
You
Sesame
know,
Street. Yeah.
and really deep lessons and
Mhm.
talking to children in a horizontal
Right.
way as
Right.
opposed to down from the mountaintop like you dumb
Mhm.
little young things, like,
Mhm.
but talking to them as if they are just tiny humans
Mm.
who
Right.
are, yes, their brains are still developing, but they are still very layered in terms of their feeling and depth and perception.
Mm.
And they immediately start to understand who is okay and who isn't. And when you look at something like the Clark doll test,
Mm.
which is very easy to find if you Google it, it's old black and white footage, but then it's been repeated over and over again to the
Right.
point where it almost became an exercise rather than an experiment or a
Mm.
test. You literally watch these Black children point to which doll was a good doll and which doll was a bad doll, and they pointed to the white doll every
Mhm.
single time.
Right.
The Black doll was bad. Where did they learn that? They actually were learning it from the media messages,
Mm.
the societal messages that they were getting every day
This is
about
black and white
themselves.
children, correct? Or white and black
There were
children?
black and white
Yeah.
children, but it started off with black children
Right.
in the
Mm.
Clark Doll test, and it's one of the things that they use, of course, for the Brown versus the Board of
Mm.
Education
Right.
as
Right.
well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Indeed. So, uh, I think that for many people, looking back in time, they can say, okay, well, you can look at Amos and Andy, you can look at, minstrel shows and, kind of blackface stereotypical representation
And the
of
fact that
African
Jim Crow law
Americans.
actually comes from the minstrel tradition. Let me say, like, the
Oh,
minstrel
can you give us
tradition
that
is Jim
history? Can you
Crow.
give us that history,
Well,
really,
I mean,
really brief?
that's what Jim Crow
Mhm.
was a minstrel character, so it was a
Right, right.
blackface character, and
Yeah,
then we actually have a whole history of
I
law
see.
in America called
Right.
Jim Crow laws,
That's
and it
literally
was
where we
based
get the
on a
name.
minstrel
Mm,
blackface character.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and so I think many people will look back at the minstrel tradition, will look back at, certain flagrant kind of representations of black people, and, clearly, I mean, some of those early, Disney and Looney Tunes sort of stuff that you don't see around
Yeah.
too much, and say, okay, I can see Joy's point for back then,
Mm,
you know, um, but again, today you point to the success of some of the people that we've mentioned and so forth. Particularly when it comes to the subject of colorism, I think it's worth unpacking that a little bit because, part of what has made African American history so socially complex on top of everything
mm,
else we've talked about and wouldn't even be able to squeeze into a conversation as short as this is the fact that there have been different social realities
mm,
uh, presented to African Americans on the basis of the very complexion of your skin, and that goes for interaction with the broader white community as well as internal sort of relationships
mm,
within the black community, and it becomes an acute point of sensitivity for us, I think, even today as we take into consideration this question of representation on screen. So I'll just tell you very quickly
mm,
that there was a point at which I'll give you a couple little examples from my own life. So I'm obviously a bit fairer complexion, and I'm um, you know biracial. Although it's another thing where people keep going back and forth on what terms to use. It's like I don't know. Call me what you will. But my dad's white, my mom's black, and I grew up being told, getting these interesting mixed signals like you got good hair, you
mm,
know that sort of like on the one hand having certain people, white and black people, seem to be more comfortable around me on perhaps on the basis of my complexion, hair texture, then also feeling like I wasn't black enough sometimes, because of these very sort of same things. I remember looking. Speaking of black representation in science fiction, I was a big Animorphs fan
mm,
as a kid.
mm.
And did you read? Do you remember
Yeah,
Animorphs?
I
K.
do.
Applegate,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
And so Animorphs, for anybody who doesn't know, was a book series about a group of American teenagers and a teenage alien who found his way to the United States, and of course, where else would he go? Uh, and wound up uh, uh, inheriting this power to transform into animals. And so each of these teenagers could transform into a different animal. And it was a really cool series. And one of them, Cassie, was a black character. And she was darker skinned. She was described as darker skinned in the book. And on the book covers, you could see that she was darker skinned. And she actually was dating Jake, who was a white boy, white teenager, and their relationship was the core love story
Mm,
of this series. And they ultimately made a TV show of Animorphs. I don't know how long
mhm,
it ran, but I remember being really excited when it came on. And when it came on, Cassie was Cassie was black, but she was distinctly different from the Cassie in the books.
mhm,
She looked like she was probably very much mixed. She was lighter complexion than I am,
mhm,
did not have the same, didn't have, coily sort of, hair texture. Her hair was much, much looser and, hanging down and so forth. And you could say, okay, well, Cassie's still black because you have this one drop rule tradition in American society.
mhm,
And yet, I, you know, I felt a little bit like, well, that's not actually Cassie as I know her, and I can only imagine for darker skinned, black girls in particular, girls who might have seen themselves in the character of Cassie in the books would have had a harder time seeing themselves in the character of Cassie, in the shows, where suddenly maybe there's a different set of incentives now that, you have kind of a Hollywood structure around it,
Mhm,
particularly given the context of the interracial relationship that was at the
mhm.
heart of the story. So, can you say a little bit for people who just are not very familiar with this subject of colorism, what it is and how it manifests in the topics that we're talking about here?
Well, I mean, I think that you spoke to it very beautifully when you said a lot of times people are like, "Well, black is black,"
Mm,
right? And of course, that is coming out of that whole one drop of tainted blood
mm,
rule that was in America for so long. But if you just look back at, not to take it all the way back to the plantation, y'all, but I'm gonna
mm.
take it all the way back to the plantation for a second.
Go ahead.
That is where it started to really take root
Mm,
for a lot of people psychologically, was right there on the plantation,
mm,
because who was in the field? The
mm,
darker skinned enslaved people.
right.
And who was in the house? The lighter skinned enslaved people. And we don't have to get into how that lighter skinned enslaved population started to come into existence, but there was a comfortability with having that lighter skinned enslaved person
Mm,
closer to you and family wise and within the household. And there were whole problems of being, within the proximity of an abuser, an oppressive abuser right there in the house that came along with that. But then we started to see, like, even when you look at the founders of Howard University,
mm,
all of the founders of the Black sororities and fraternities, they are extremely, extremely light skinned, right? A lot of the thinkers, W.B. Du Bois,
mhm.
you know,
Sure.
the very, very light skinned. And so, yeah, there was opportunity that started arising for when you were closer to white.
Mm,
And for a long time, I don't know if it's still there, but there was a church not far from where I grew up in Georgia that actually had a piece of wood outside of the church. It was a black church. But if you were darker than the piece of wood, and the wood was about the color of birch,
mm,
if you were darker than the piece of wood, then you could not come into the church and worship,
mm,
because light is what gets into heaven.
mm,
And there have even been studies that showed that if you went into a black church and you changed the iconography of Jesus and the Virgin Mary and all that stuff to a darker skinned representation graphically,
mhm.
that people would stop attending the church.
Right. Mm,
There is something to this colorism. And it's there, people knew that it was the reason why people were conking their hair,
mm,
relaxing their hair, straightening their hair, trying to be more passable within the body,
mhm,
because they were told that their body as it is not acceptable. So if you want your body to be okay, well, you need to get, thin, look
mhm,
as young as possible, and look like you have some money. And looking like you have some money means looking closer to white.
mhm,
And there are lots of studies. You don't have to take my word for it. There's a lots of things that you can Google, research, and the people will go deep into a lot of this mindset around this, and the way that it flowers out.
mm,
On screen, we see it exactly the way that you saw it with Animorphs.
mm,
You want something to be successful, you got to be careful about how dark your leading lady is going to be. When Lupita won the Oscar, there was a lot of chatter about, is she going to have opportunity to do things, because like, she's really, really dark.
right. Mhm,
Unlike Halle Berry,
mhm,
she's really
right.
dark.
Yeah.
It was a
Mhm,
whole topic of conversation, you
mhm,
know? And even when you look at the roles that Viola Davis gets a lot of acclaim for, they're not necessarily roles that are celebrating her beauty
her
and her,
femininity
right,
and
and
right.
her ingenueness per
Mhm,
se.
right.
And when she gets to those types of roles and levels, a lot of times she's bringing that project to herself, and maybe she'll have
Mhm,
be able to do more of that now that she's really become Viola Davis.
yeah.
But a
Mhm,
lot of, the roles that she
mhm,
really cut her teeth on, she was, able to show her prowess as an
mhm.
actor. But
I
the
bumped
roles,
into her once when she was on set shooting an episode of what was it? I'm forgetting. It was a legal.
Oh, it's How to Get Away with Murder?
Yes,
Okay.
and just to say that she's magnificently beautiful and
Absolutely.
magnetic. Yeah.
It's
Mm-hmm.
stunning and magnificent, but again, the representation around that on screen, not really there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen this even when they did the Hate You Give, right? And Amanda Steinberg was put in that role, and she's the lightest person in the family, in
Mm-hmm.
the whole family,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think she did a great job in the role, but there isn't the same kind of Hollywood vehicle
Mm-hmm.
around that younger talent coming up, being able to be getting those roles and cutting their teeth on things and really making a name for
Mm-hmm.
themselves is like a paper bag test.
So when Zoe Saldana who I'm a big fan of, but when she gets cast as
Nina
Nina
Simone.
Simone,
Mhm.
who was a darker skinned woman, obviously a deeply significant cultural figure in Black history, singer
Mhm.
and activist. Um, this is why a lot of folks get upset, right?
Yeah.
Because you have this history sort of trailing trailing behind. But it's such a there's so much um, that's complex about it. Now, I'd be curious to know how you react to people who express concern about, yeah, but isn't it sort of antithetical to sort of the artistic sort of spirit to have sort of like, say, let's say, a quota system in
Mm.
place, right? Like, when we're telling stories, when we're, casting, people for roles, isn't the solution ultimately to embrace an equal opportunity mindset that's, mindful about the context of a given story and so forth, that, doesn't take everybody as being interchangeable necessarily. But don't we risk something if we say to ourselves, okay, we've got to make sure we've got X number of people, of, this race and this skin shade, within this race, to create sort of something of a cookie cutter formula by which we can meet the perfect kind of diversity sort of like format. Does that sort of approach have the potential of sapping from sort of, just, and this is a controversial phrase, granted, but sort of a merit-based approach to, like, artistic expression that says, let's go with the folks who are, have got the talent and who can bring the goods to the screen? What do you say to people who have that concern?
If you've ever made a movie or a TV show, you know that the entire process is subjective and intentional.
Right.
It's collaborative,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also subjective and intentional. And I hear the things about equality, and I don't believe in quotas and I don't
Mm-hmm.
believe in checking boxes. This
Okay.
is about the stories that we tell and how we tell them.
Mm-hmm.
But we also can't act like equality and equity are the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
or like we're stepping into an equitable system, because if we were, we wouldn't be having these conversations. Like the whole thing is that we don't have equity right now. We're striving toward it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, it's just still about who's in the room and who's getting cut out of the room and what are you being intentional around. And I don't know about you, but when I go outside and I walk around in most places that have a very much metropolitan and
Mm-hmm.
diverse population, I see all types of lots of different
Mm-hmm.
people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
And
not
more and
just
more. Mm-hmm.
right, and it's not just about shade. It's also about I see people who have disabilities, but they don't show up on screen a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it does make sense to make sure that if you're in some kind of crowded restaurant, that there are some people sitting at the table that have disabilities, because why wouldn't they be? That's what goes on in the real world when you're in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
That what goes on in the real world when you're in LA.
Right.
Okay, if you're in certain places and it is more, monochromatic in terms of certain things, okay, this starts to make some sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and I think that we're not really arguing about that. What we're talking about is stories that are taking place in modern times in very particular places in particular ways. And why would we not have that?
Mm,
We get it immediately with gender. When Gina Davis was talking about, wow, there are these moments where like people crowd around something and the entire crowd is men. Do
mhm.
women not gather? You immediately understand it. Oh
Right.
yes, women also gather. That makes sense. We should
Sure.
we should have women in the
Mhm.
crowd too.
Right.
So why wouldn't we actually show the beautiful diversity of the human body
Mm,
and the way that it expresses itself as a form of life?
mm,
I see we get down to if this was a set, there would be someone deciding exactly what kind of wood that table should be, exactly what kind of cork, what the shade of the cork should be. And I mean, literally holding up 5 different shades of cork to figure
mm,
out which coaster is the best one to
right.
give the kind of aesthetic sense
Mm,
that you want to bring into it. It's always subjective and intentional.
mm,
So why can't we be intentional about the representation?
indeed. I have one last question to you about a vein of this representation question that I don't hear it discussed very often. However, a friend of mine who's been a guest on the show, Bertrand Cooper, who is a young policy analyst concerned with issues of poverty. He wrote an article. You may have seen it. It appeared in Current Affairs, and I think that the title of it was "Who Gets to Make Black Popular Culture."
Mm,
And his argument in that piece, well, his what that piece was about was his feeling that within the Black community, there's a degree to which, granted the larger history of exclusion that you're mentioning, the larger issues of representation, that within the Black community, they have Black artistic community specifically, there's been deep diving for a long time into telling the story of Black America in a way that focuses on telling the story, particularly of the Black poor, in many
mm,
cases,
mm,
right? Through inner city life, violence, portrayals of the prison system, so on and so forth. That the particular life experience of poor Black people in inner city communities and rural communities to a degree informs the larger American relationship to Black culture in general. And yet, when you look at the creators that make up the community of talent in Hollywood, but also just the Black filmmaking industry, sort of in general, you don't see representation of Black poor people either on screen or behind screen. That in general, the class of folks, who come forward here are educated from middle class and suburban areas who are then, he feels, portraying an avenue of the Black experience that, we may all be Black, but and he's somebody who grew up in deep poverty, that his experience and the experience of poor Black people like himself is very different from that of the Black folks who are telling the story, which would be okay with him for him if there were also opportunities created for poor Black people to be represented
mm,
directly as actors and content creators and directors and executives and so forth. If there are avenues for that type of uplift that were presented. Um, is there any credence to the argument that there's also a class-based area of representation that needs to be focused on? And is that something you have any opinions about?
I mean, I can't speak directly to
Mm,
the article because I haven't read it, but
mm,
based upon what you're saying to me, I think so. I
mm,
think that there's a class and a caste
mm,
issue.
mm,
And I see it even in relation to, I remember one time I was talking to a script doctor.
mm,
And a script doctor is someone that you go to when you're having issues with your script, and they
mm.
basically help you like work your script out, right? Like be
Right.
like, okay, take this out, move this around. This is the plot's all wrong here. You
Right.
got jumbled on page 20,
Hmm.
And so he is like really successful script doctor.
Mm,
And he was talking about the process of going into the room like to pitch as a filmmaker and basically walking into the room ready, 5 projects ready to go,
mm,
right? And we were talking about this one Black female director that basically they shot her shot and not a lot happened because she didn't have enough projects ready to go. And one of the things that I was saying is it's not necessarily reasonable to expect a lot of Black women in America to have the conspicuous leisure to be able to get 5 projects
mm,
pristinely together
right.
and ready to pitch when they come into the room. That requires time.
Mm.
That requires enough time within your life, leisure wise, to be able to put those things together. And there is a truth to if you're working two, three jobs
Mm.
just to get by, you are not getting the same types of opportunities. Hollywood and the entertainment media has always been a system that has been thriving on the idea of scarcity.
Mm.
It's a scarcity from go ahead and shut up and be happy to be here and have this job because there's 18 million other people in line ready to take it if you don't want it.
Mhm.
So suffer this abuse because this is just the way that the system is. To there's not enough over here, but we're going to put all these resources over there. There's no money to get this, to get this funded, but we can spend $200 million on this type of movie because this is the thing that we see getting the real return on. So it's always functioned on this idea of scarcity and lack. But even within LA, we found that I think that Mayor Garcetti actually had to revamp an entire program that he was doing because they were supposed to be creating like a nice like internship and pipeline for people right here in Los Angeles to be able to get into the entertainment industry.
Mm.
And the poorest kids were not able to participate in the
Interesting.
program.
Right.
So yeah, like if you're expected to be able to work your way up from a mailroom and like intern for 5 years completely unpaid,
Mm.
there's not a lot of
Mhm.
opportunity. If you're middle class already or upper middle class, well, you can ride that wave a little bit easier than someone that has deeper financial obligations. And so have never thought that anything where humans are concerned is a monolith. And that
Mm.
includes the idea of blackness
Right.
or what we call blackness and the black experience and black people, not a monolith.
Mm.
We didn't decide that we were black. We got called black, but we
Mm.
turned ourselves into a people. And there's so many stories within that. And so the whole thing needs to open up for everybody. And that's part of why I do the work that I do, not just for the people that have the closest shot to opportunity, but for the people that it's so far away. There are entirely too many people in this country right now that they don't have a project that's finished over $300, $500.
Mm.
And that's nothing for a lot of people that are middle class or upper middle class. They spent that on some shoes.
Mm.
So the fact that there's someone that they've got a brilliant voice and they are in what I call a developing economy right here in the United States, and
Yeah.
they can't get their thing, their beautiful piece of art finished
Mm.
over $300, $500, I think speaks a lot to what's going on in relation to access and what's not happening in relation to equity.
Mm.
And that's completely different conversation than equality and saying everyone is equal. But what are we actually doing to actualize the fact that everyone is equal, but things have not been equal or equitable for a very long time?
We'll leave it there for now, but the conversation continues. Joy Donnell, how can people follow you? How can people keep up with your work?
Well, you can definitely find me personally on pretty much every social media platform. Do It in Public is my handle. And then you can find out more about the Center for Intersectional Media and Entertainment at CIME, CIME.us.
Beautiful. We'll include some links in the description. And thank you very much once again for just being willing to talk to me in general,
It's
and
always a
for
pleasure.
and for coming by the set. We really appreciate it, and look forward to having you back soon. And so, folks, if you enjoyed this conversation, more to the point, if you believe, as we believe, that empathy with the stories, with the lived experiences of our fellow Americans across the color spectrum, across the political spectrum, is what will allow us to be able to revive the spirit of our democracy. If you believe in the importance of bringing people together for the hard conversations that allows us to understand the truth about where we are coming from as a people, then join us as a member at braverangels.org. We are having these conversations in community by community, online, on college campuses. Be a part of it. Be a part of the work to build a house united. Like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. I'm John Wood Jr. Until next time.